people who've dated a psycho, what incident made you aware that you were dating a psycho? He had very specific preferences for how he liked his noodles cooked. Al dente, but just a little bit softer than that. He was obsessed with his texture and always insisted that I cook the noodles because, apparently, I managed to get them closer to his ideal texture than he could. One day I came home after working a 12-hour shift and a long commute of nearly an hour. The first thing he said to me was, "I'm hungry, make some noodles." Given that he had been home all day and knowing his tendency to throw tantrums, I was too exhausted to argue. I quietly went into the kitchen and started making the noodles. I don't know if it was because of how tired I was or something else, but I didn't get the noodles out as quickly as he wanted. They ended up being softer than he usually liked. I plated the noodles, seasoned them, and set the plate down in front of him. Then I went to the bedroom to shower and get some rest. While I was halfway through changing, I suddenly heard a loud crash. A plate of noodles had been thrown against the wall. Then I felt something in the back of my head, and the next thing I remember, I was seeing the bathroom tiles turning red and the world going gray. He was hurting me, and I could barely make out his words. "You're going to regret messing with me if you ever make me soggy noodles again." When I regained consciousness, he was sitting in the living room watching TV as if nothing had happened. I tried to leave to go to the hospital, but he stopped me before I could get out the door. He blocked the exit and, with a terrifying smile that still haunts me, said, "You're not going anywhere until I get my noodles." Later that night, I managed to sneak out and walk to a nearby hospital. Police were called and I passed a restraining order. Friends from work helped me gather what was left of my belongings from the apartment. Most of my stuff had been thrown out. It was at that moment that I fully realized just how dangerous and unstable he was. I knew for certain that he was a danger to my life. Man is the only animal that refuses to be what he is. Story 2. One night after an argument that was probably about something small, my girlfriend and I were lying in bed. She somehow fell out of the bed. Maybe she rolled out, but it looked like she fell. She got up and started running into the walls. She hurt herself badly. I tried to stop her, but I couldn't. It was really upsetting and I felt helpless. Our neighbor downstairs heard the commotion and called the police. When the police arrived, they saw my girlfriend sitting on the couch. They immediately became very interested in me and seemed to suspect I might be involved. I tried to explain to them that she had been running into the walls by herself, but they found it hard to believe. Luckily, while they were there, she suddenly stood up and ran across the room, going into a wall that she almost lost consciousness. This helped show the police that my explanation was true and that she was hurting herself, not that I was responsible. The police decided to escort me to the hospital, probably because they were still unsure about me and wanted to make sure everything was okay. When we arrived at the hospital, the staff took my girlfriend into a separate room. I assumed they were asking her questions privately to make sure I wasn't hurting her. After they finished their questioning, they allowed me to join her in the back room. While we were waiting, she got out of bed and went to a cabinet where they kept the gauze. She grabbed a bunch of it and began wiping the floor. I was confused and asked her what she was doing. She told me she was cleaning the floor so the fish could see out of it. She ended up staying in the hospital for 2 months, on the top floor. During that time, I visited her regularly to see how she was doing. That was it? No follow-up? What was happening? Story 3. When I was a teen, I dated a girl for about a month with no experience in relationships. When the girl I was dating told me she liked it when guys were confident and took the initiative, I wasn't sure if she was serious. I thought she might have been joking, so I didn't try to make a move after our next date. I dropped her off at my house, and she was upset with me for not following her advice. We ended up being intimate, and she told me that I should take the initiative next time. On our next day, we were sitting in my car with the sunroof open, looking at the stars. I started engaging with her, but she pushed me away and said, "What are you doing? Do you really think I'm the kind of girl you can just put yourself on whenever you want?" Even now, I still don't know if she was testing me or if she actually had a specific preference where she wanted me to keep trying while she pretended to resist. If that was the case, she should have been very clear about it from the start. For me, if someone says no, it means no, and I'm not going to try anything after that. The whole situation was really confusing for me, and because of it, that date ended up being the last time I saw her. Story 4. He asked me to pick up a present he had bought for his friend's baby shower from Kids R Us. When I got there and asked for the order, the store staff said they didn't have any record of it. I called him to sort it out and then handed the phone to the cashier so she could talk to him. After a short while, she returned the phone to me and said, "I will not be talked to like that." I was really confused by this comment. She explained that he had been very rude to her and refused to help me with the order, so I decided to leave the store. When I got home, he denied being rude to the cashier and got angry with me for taking her side. He said I had ruined everything, that we wouldn't be going to the baby shower because his friend was very upset with us. I felt really confused and awful about the whole situation, so I decided to call his friend to apologize. When I spoke to his friend, she had no idea what I was talking about. She didn't know anything about an issue with the store or being upset. That's when I realized he had lied about the entire situation just to make me feel like a bad person. This was a wake-up call for me and made me realize he had been gaslighting me throughout our entire 3-year relationship. He was constantly making me feel bad about things he had made up to make me doubt myself. Story 5. I was dating a girl who had some pretty demanding and controlling habits. She insisted that I call her every day, which felt really restrictive. She also had a habit of hurting me if she thought I was sitting in a way she didn't like. One time she got really angry at me over something on a popular social media website in my country called Lunar Storm. On this site you could see who visited your profile. She noticed that a lot of people from my hometown had looked at her profile and got furious. She told me that I should talk about her more so people wouldn't be curious about her. When I suggested that talking more about her might actually make people more curious, she completely lost it and screamed at me. Another time she yelled at me because I mentioned to other people that a family member of mine had attempted to end it all before I told her about it. She was extremely upset about this. Even though she was attractive, her behavior was very unstable and difficult to handle. Eventually, I decided to break up with her. Years after the breakup, she kept sending me emails accusing me of ruining her life. A few years later, I happened to run into her on a train. She was with her new boyfriend, who looked like he was very compliant to her. Story 6. I was married to someone who turned out to be very deceitful. One day he told me he was going to the woods to end it all. I was very worried, so I called the police and told him I thought he might be having PTSD from his time in the military. The police stopped him, took his weapon, and then informed me that he was never in the military at all. This was 4 years into our marriage, and I was shocked and confused. I took photos of all the damage he had caused in her home, including holes in the walls, and decided to get a restraining order and a divorce. The court doesn't look favorably on someone using false military service as an excuse for his actions. After I took a nap and woke up to see a lot of comments and upvotes on my post, I realized that my ex was actually good for something, getting attention to my story. To give more context, my first husband was a real veteran and preferred that we not discuss his military service after he retired. We lived near a military base, so it was normal for me not to talk about his service. His brothers were also in the military, and my ex claimed to be embarrassed for not being like them, so I respected his wish and didn't bring it up at family events. It turned out that he was very good at deceiving people. He was a skilled con artist, manipulator. He did the same things to his second wife, who also ended up divorcing him. Story 7. This happened to a friend of mine, not to me. His girlfriend had been traveling to a particular city for months because her mother was sick with lupus and needed a lot of care. One day, just before leaving for another trip to visit her mother, she broke up with my friend. She said she felt like she was being a bad girlfriend because she couldn't spend enough time with him. Our friend handled the breakup really well and wished her the best. He even said that they might get back together once her mother got better. That weekend, she kept texting him about how tough it was to take care of her mother and how she hadn't slept at all because she was staying at the hospital. During all of this, my friend was incredibly supportive. He sent her information about lupus and other helpful stuff. A few days later, my friend was scrolling through Facebook and saw a 360-degree panoramic photo posted by someone he knew who had also been involved with his ex. The picture was taken at a popular music festival in the city where his ex's mother lived. When my friend looked closely at the photo, he saw his ex in the crowd, clearly having a great time at the festival with his ex. It turns out that instead of visiting her sick mother, she had actually gone to the music festival and got back together with a guy. My friend found photos of her at the festival all weekend, which meant she was there the whole time and all her texts about being at the hospital were lies. He even started to question if her mother ever had lupus, or if she was just using that as an excuse to be with a guy. When my friend confronted her about it, she just ignored him and disappeared. It was completely odd. It wasn't even that angry, mostly just sad for her. He felt that she could have broken up with him months earlier, but instead, she chose to lie a lot so she could have both the relationship and her time with this other guy. My friend really wonders if she feels any guilt or remorse about what she did. My friend has started going to therapy and is doing really well. He understands that he might have some trust issues in the future, so he wants to address them as soon as possible. I'm really impressed with how he's handling this difficult situation emotionally. Story 8. When I was very young and naive, something happened that has stayed with me and affected my mental health. It started suddenly, got really bad. It began with him posting all of my personal information online. He shared my full name, address, and other details where anyone could see them. That was already very upsetting. Then he started sending me proof of him hurting himself. He'd share videos of him consuming entire containers of tablets. That was when I knew I needed to get away from him. Story 9. We were having dinner at a restaurant when he suddenly got up and started shouting. He yelled things like, "I'm going to fire out all your windows." This was because he saw a waiter glance at me. He also attempted to hurt me, claimed he was younger than he really was. He even hid his ID from me, which I found out the reason for later, and lied about almost everything. He also kept unregistered weapons in his house, which made him seem very shady. I ended up believing him after he got so angry that he hurt our kitten. I took the kitten with me. Looking back, I realized I was really naive. Story 10. We met at bars because we both enjoyed drinking. I could easily finish a fifth of vodka in one night, and so could she, even though she weighed 135 pounds. She would often stay over and we'd spend the evenings drinking in the tub or watching movies with drinks. Sometimes I'd wake up to her pounding drinks at 5 a.m. I decided to limit the drinks in the house because she would drink all day if there was too much. One morning when I had run out of intoxicants, she demanded that I take her to the store to buy her a Four Loko. I was already running late for work and tried to leave, but she was only in a robe and insisted on coming with me. She wouldn't get out of the car until I got her the drink. I drove past a nearby 7-Eleven and she got so mad that she threw my car into park while I was driving 40 miles per hour. She was definitely a mix of beauty but deeply troubled. Story 11. When I was younger and had my first long-term boyfriend, it wasn't obvious at first. He had some strange habits that seemed small at the beginning. If he was focused on something, he'd ignore me, even if he had invited me to join them. He wasn't bad, just odd. As time went on, he started making me cancel my plans to spend time with him instead. He isolated me, so I was almost always with him, and he would monitor everything I did, including looking through my phone. One time, a friend kissed me on the cheek in front of him as a joke, and although he laughed, he later yelled at me about it. He showed different sides of himself to different people. Over time, his behavior escalated from being a caring boyfriend to controlling me completely. Thankfully, one day he suddenly lost interest, like a switch. It was painful to be dumped without explanation, but looking back, I'm grateful it happened. About 6 months ago, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I'm not sure of the details, but he's in the spectrum of that condition. Story 12. It was a typical Sunday evening. My ex-husband had been unemployed for a few years and knew I had to approve dozens of employees' time cards every Sunday night to process payroll for Monday. This task took about an hour and a half and had been doing it every week for 3 years. My ex was a heavy drinker with a terrible temper. That night, after I had spent an hour cooking dinner for him and our son, he got very upset about me working on the time cards. I was sitting on the living room floor because we couldn't afford a couch. As I was eating dinner and working, he started yelling at me to stop working and pay attention to him. Before I could even explain that I just needed a few more minutes, he came up to me with a plate of food. He took a big bite of tilapia, chewed it, and then reached over my keyboard. I was in complete shock. I couldn't believe that the man I was married to would do something so awful. I just sat there stunned. Story 13. I went to get an IUD, but it went terribly wrong, and I ended up passing out. I had to go to the ER for an ultrasound. My boyfriend was mostly worried about the intimacy, which was frustrating until my roommate got really angry at him. He then said, "Oh, I didn't realize it was a misunderstanding." I also needed infusions at the center for my ulcerative colitis. I wanted him to come with me because it gets boring and he makes it easier, especially since it often takes several tries to find a vein. The infusion takes about 4 hours, but he didn't want to come. I told him it was okay, but he offered to pick me up. When the infusion ran 15 minutes late because they used a very small syringe, he got angry, left, and I had to call an Uber to get home because he didn't want to wait. The final straw was when I had spent the past few months taking care of him while he had a severe case of disease. We had plans to move to a different state because I got my dream job and he said he wanted to be with me. He was there for my graduation and we took lots of photos, but just 3 days later, he broke up with me over the phone, blocked my number, and gave no explanation. He's tried to contact me a few times since then, but the last time I told him to leave me alone and blocked his number again. Story 14. I was the psycho in this situation, though I don't like using that term because it adds to the stigma around mental health. I have borderline personality disorder, or BPD. When I was a teenager, I was undiagnosed and extremely stressed, living with a mistreating parent with a drinking problem. During that time, I had very little self-control. I was mean and manipulative, using relationships and friendships to gain power and control over others. I didn't like how I acted and hated myself for being mean. I was struggling a lot with my mental health, but I'm not saying that's an excuse for my behavior, just an explanation. I felt like I had no control over my own life, so I tried to control other people as a way to cope. People with borderline personality disorder, or BPD, might seem like they're just causing chaos and trouble, but in reality, we're very sensitive. We don't have much emotional protection, so we often put on a tough, mean front to protect ourselves. BPD is more common in women, so that tough persona can sometimes be seen as a tough girl attitude. People with BPD are extremely afraid of abandonment, either real or perceived. We're terrified that people we love, trust, or look up to will abandon us. We fear that we'll be judged as harshly as we judge ourselves. We have chronically low self-esteem, unstable self-image, believe we're not deserving of love, and we're unworthy of healthy relationships. So what do? Well, if we believe someone is going to leave us anyway, we prefer to strike preemptively. I'm going to be as terrible as possible, so you'll break up with me. We also struggle with compartmentalization, meaning we flip-flop between black and white, love and hate, good and evil. If you're being nice to us, we absolutely idolize you, trust you completely, worship you as a god, and believe you're not capable of doing anything wrong. Then when you inevitably make a mistake, since you're only human of course, we immediately flip 180 degrees and demonize your entire existence. Not because we actually hate you, but rather in self-defense from perceived threat of abandonment or rejection. That's a really good book in this subject with a benefiting title, I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. I would encourage anyone struggling with BPD, either because you have it, your partner does, or even if you think your ex might have, to read it. It's incredibly helpful in understanding the chaotic storm of emotions and destructive behaviors. The key thing to know is that people with BPD are almost always being self-destructive. We're really trying to hurt ourselves, not other people. The rates of these bad habits are extremely frequent for us. It's also important that partners of people with BPD seek therapy or at least find some ways to process what they've endured. There's some legitimate trauma that can stem from those relationships, for both partners. I was finally diagnosed with an unholy combination of PTSD, OCD, ADHD, and anxiety, all in the last 2 years. However, I've made so much progress that my current therapist and doctor both aren't sure if I have enough qualifying BPD traits left, especially after doing DBT and CBT for so long. I wish I had been given the resources at the time to figure myself out. I wish someone had noticed how much pain I was in, that I was being taken advantage of, but that I desperately wanted to be loved. I wish I could say I'm sorry to the people I hurt. Not that I really deserve forgiveness. Grace is earned, not owed, but I still live with guilt over my past and make a conscious effort to be a better person every day. Oh, one bit of interesting news. BPD might undergo a name change to emotional instability disorder, possibly reclassifying it as not a personality disorder anymore too. In the upcoming DSM-6, as more researchers are advocating to end the negative stigma towards it and mental health in general, I ended up going into the psych field myself. Forensic psych degree, and my primary focus and field of study is personality disorders. That's the best way to turn things around, in my opinion. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 15. I went to his place before he got home from work. As usual, I used to open his computer all the time because I knew the password. That day I found a bunch of dating sites open, like Fling and Cougar Life. I couldn't believe it. I looked at his messages and saw he had been trying to meet up with women nearby for a while. I called him and he panicked, saying he set up the accounts for a friend. I knew he was lying, but I wanted closure, so I stayed to wait for him to come home. That was a mistake. When he got home, I broke up with him and things got really scary. He took my phone and keys, shut the door, and blocked me from leaving. It was terrifying because he was much bigger than me, and I felt completely powerless. Eventually, I ended up on the couch, feeling detached from everything. That's when I realized how harsh he had been. I had been in a bad situation for a while without fully understanding it. I finally talked him down and he let me go. I didn't go to the police because I was in shock, but I had bruises on my arm and I was shaky for days. Found out way later that he was charged with false imprisonment of another woman down the line and he only received probation. And I really wish I'd gone to the cops when it happened to me. If I had, I have no doubt that he'd be in prison now after his second offense. You want to know the worst part? I ended up getting back together with him and stayed with him for a few more months. Things got even worse before he finally broke up for good. After that, he tried to contact me for years. Even now, I still have panic attacks when I hear a man yelling at a woman and I get nervous about unknown phone numbers. I check court records now and then, hoping he's not around or in prison. I'm not dumb. I know how hard it is to leave a traumatic relationship. I have a lot more understanding now for women who stay with their bad partners. What an incredible yet heartbreaking story. Stay strong, ladies. You can do it. Don't wait until it's too late. Story 16. It all started with seemingly small issues. At first, he would compare me to his exes, but he always did it in a way that made it sound like he was being positive about me. He seemed really eager to join in on the activities and hobbies I enjoyed on my own. He would push his way into these activities, and although he initially seemed enthusiastic, he would often end up pouting or making fun of them. These comments started as harmless jokes about my interests, which I would laugh off, but they kept getting more frequent and more hurtful over time. He also started giving me backhanded compliments. These were subtle put-downs disguised as compliments. Whenever I caught on and got upset about his comments, he would just smile and say he was joking, but his smile never reached his eyes, making it clear that he wasn't really sincere. Despite his behavior, he had the most striking blue eyes I had ever seen. They were so light they almost looked white. However, I began to notice that there was something missing behind those beautiful eyes, an emptiness that troubled me. One night, while we were relaxing on the couch, drinking and watching a game, he suddenly said he wanted to end it all. I took his comment seriously and began asking him more questions about it. He just shook his head back and forth as if he was in a daze and said he hadn't said that at all. His reaction was confusing and unsettling. Things got only worse from there. The emotional mistreatment, which had started with subtle remarks, escalated into more overt and damaging behavior. Although I knew things were getting bad, I still remembered the good times we had shared, which made it hard for me to leave. Eventually, things came to a head when he hurt me in a fit of rage. Afterward, he tried to make amends by calling me, showing up at my work and sending me flowers. My sister played a crucial role in helping me through this difficult time. I hadn't shared much of what was going on with my family because she had been isolating me and making me feel like I was overreacting. When he mistreated me, I went straight to my sister for help. Even though he kept calling and texting me while I was with her, she took my phone and told me firmly, "He's putting you in danger. You know that, right?" Her words were a wake-up call. I left him, left everything I had at his house, and eventually moved on. It took years of healing and dating people who were more stable and grounded, but I finally moved past it. Story 17. Here's a simplified version of what happened. I'd planned a date with a girl I'd been chatting with online. When I picked her up, she was already on the phone with her estranged father. She got in the car and I started driving us to the movies. She stayed on the phone with him the whole day, which was about 15 minutes. It turned out she was asking him for money because she needed help with his situation. She'd removed him out of her life years ago, but was now trying to make amends so he'd send her money. Halfway to the movie, she asked if I could stop at the Dollar General so she could buy a green dot card or something similar. Even though we hadn't met before and it felt awkward, I agreed. She went into the store, stayed on the phone, and came out with a card. While she was crying and pretending to be emotional, she gave her father the card details and thanked him for the money. After hanging up, she abruptly switched from her emotional act, spoke to her father rudely, and then cheerfully apologized for the awkwardness as if nothing had happened. That's definitely a good warning sign. It seems like she was extremely manipulative and deceitful. Story 18. My husband has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and sometimes shows signs of schizophrenia. He wasn't like this until about 8 years into our relationship. Out of nowhere, he lost all trust in me. He started having hallucinations and believed they proved I was unfaithful. If I wore a nice dress or makeup, he saw it as a sign of infidelity. His jealousy grew out of control. He would ignore me for days and then get angry if he saw me talking to a coworker or smiling at a store clerk. He even began logging into my Google account and tracking my phone. If my location showed that I was near a restaurant where my work is located, he would think I was lying about being at work. I was extremely unhappy. The person I had trusted and built a life with suddenly turned against me. We agreed he needed to see a doctor, and he did. With his diagnosis, I realized he was experiencing differently beyond normal. Things are starting to improve now. Story 19. I worked with my ex because we were both correctional officers. This job involves a lot of background checks and mental health assessments, so I thought it would be a good way to make sure he was stable and trustworthy. We dated for a few months before I moved in with him. About a year into our relationship, after we found out we were expecting a baby, he started to change dramatically. One night while I was tucking my oldest son from my previous marriage into bed, he told me with tears in his eyes, "Mama, I see the devil in his eyes." This really scared me. We had already noticed that his behavior was becoming erratic and unsettling. He started saying things that made us worried about his mental health. The first major sign of trouble was how he seemed to switch between different personalities depending on the situation. This made it hard to know who he was or how he would react. While I was getting the house ready for the new baby, I discovered a box of books about something called verbal judo. I'd never heard of this before, and it made me realize that something was seriously wrong. As I began to understand what was going on, his behavior became even more threatening. He started making threats about what he would do if I tried to leave him. He would show us a projectile he claimed had his name on it, leaving it in places where we could see it or just leaving it lying around. He even hung a noose on the back deck of our house, letting it swing in the wind for weeks as a frightening warning. Eventually, I managed to get myself and my boys out of that dangerous situation, but things didn't get better right away. In fact, they got worse. His friends from the sheriff's office began following me wherever I went. I had never had any legal trouble before this, not even a speeding ticket. One time while I was shopping at Walmart, a security guard who was a friend of his accused me of shoplifting. They claimed to have video evidence of me stealing, but the video footage was mysteriously lost, and the charges were eventually dropped. Despite this, the intimidation continued. Now I'm in a legal battle for custody of my son. My ex is keeping him from me out of spite, and it tears me apart every day. I worry about what my son might be going through and feel helpless because I can't be there to protect him. Story 20. I used to be really messed up, and I realize now that I was the problem in my past relationship. We were together for 6 years, and it wasn't until she broke up with me that I started to understand how badly I had acted. I had to go through therapy and do a lot of work on myself to get better. I could come up with reasons for my behavior, but honestly, they're just excuses. I was just being mean and didn't want to admit that I was the one at fault. After we broke up, I tried to win her back in really unhealthy ways. For example, I made paper hearts with messages about how much I loved her and placed them all over her car while she was at work. To me, it didn't seem like stalking, but looking back, that's exactly what it was. She didn't appreciate this gesture, and when she didn't respond the way I wanted, I blamed her for taking away my chance to be with her. I accused her of stealing my time, affection, and emotional connection, even though she was trying to move on and had already made it clear she didn't want to be with me. I also tried to ruin her new relationship by snooping through her email and Facebook accounts. I found some conversations that I thought were inappropriate and sent screenshots of them to her parents, who I knew well. I tried to do this anonymously, but when she confronted me about it, I lied and said I didn't know who was responsible. We both knew I wasn't fooling anyone. As if that wasn't enough, I started all bad habits as a way to get back at her for the pain I felt. It was my way of retaliating and coping with the hurt, but it only made things worse. It hurts to remind myself of all this, so I'll stop there. I'm a better person now, but it took therapy, rehab, and God himself to make me realize I was for society and men as a whole. I watched my life go off-road and straight for a pedestrian walkway, and the scariest thing was that I was behind the wheel and knew it. I couldn't pretend to be innocent and inexperienced. I couldn't claim unending heartbreak, and I couldn't put the blame on someone who, through no fault of her own, just stopped loving me. I was hurt, and I wanted her to hurt as bad as I did, and so I destroyed everything around me that I cared about. I love all the wonderful things and great friends I found in therapy and rehab, but I wish I'd learned those things before acting out. When you show colors like that, no matter how much better you've gotten, people just don't trust or like you anymore. I'll probably have to move someday so I can have a name that doesn't turn faces into hateful, angry sneers of pure disdain. I'm a scourge in this town, and no matter how much you try to clean a blackened name into at least a semblance of a memory of white, everyone will remember only the color they saw when the spotlight landed on you when it was time to show everyone what you're made of. Regardless of what I am made of now, when it counted and everyone was watching me at that moment, I was made of hate and anger and bitterness, and no one will forget it. Story 21. Not quite as strange, but while driving to a coffee shop where I was supposed to work on my thesis, my ex and I heard on the radio about the aircraft hitting the towers. I then said, "That wasn't an accident." He called me a bunch of awful comments and rambled on about how ignorant it was to acknowledge that. Of course it was an accident. Nobody would do that on purpose. When we arrived at the coffee shop, a TV and a cart had been rolled out and placed in the center of the dining area so that the customers can watch what's happening. He observed while sitting. As we watched live footage, one of the towers eventually collapsed. I immediately started crying when I realized I had just seen innocent people pass away. I was shocked to see that some people were still inside the building. My brother was traveling at the time and his plane had to land early. He had to rent a car to get home, but luckily he was safe. I was deeply horrified. Anyone with a heart would have been, too. My ex, who was sitting next to me, bent over and I assumed he was trying to comfort me when he wrapped his arm around me. "You are embarrassing me. Stop crying. It's making a scene." He growled at me. I realized I was done with the relationship and started planning to leave since we shared an apartment. After an argument one day, I wanted to go out with friends, but he got upset and didn't want me to go. He had me against the wall, wanting to hurt me, then laughed it off. The next day, while he was at work, I packed my things and left. He was devastated, but he just didn't seem to understand how serious it was. Story 21. Please bear with me as I share a troubling experience from my past. I was dating a guy who claimed he was a firefighter in New York. For a while, everything seemed fine, but after a few months, I discovered that he wasn't actually a firefighter. Instead, he was getting used to intoxicants with serious issues. When I decided to end the relationship, things took a dark turn. He started making threats, saying that I couldn't leave him because he was involved with the Mafia. He claimed that if I broke up with him, his guys would come after me and my family. He even told me he had a detailed file on my father and his business, that he knew everything about them. The moment I realized just how unhinged he was during a particularly alarming incident, one day he showed up at my car covered in red liquid and said he had been jumped. He begged me to drive him to the hospital. I took him there, but once we arrived, the doctor pulled me aside and said he suspected that he had actually inflicted self-injury on himself. It turned out that his whole story was a fabrication designed to manipulate me into feeling sorry for him and to get me to take him to the hospital. After that night, things went from bad to worse. He trapped me in the relationship for several months. On one occasion, he threatened me with a weapon and wouldn't let me go to work because he said someone named Tony was coming over to meet me. Of course, Tony never showed up. He also left me threatening voicemails, which only made things more terrifying. I tried to seek help by calling the police and played them one of the threatening voicemails, but they told me there was nothing they could do with just that information. I also went to get a restraining order, only to find out that he already had 9 restraining orders against him, mostly from his own parents. Eventually, I managed to escape the situation by moving to a different state. It was a horrifying experience, but getting out of that environment was crucial for my safety and well-being. Story 23. I dated a girl in college for 2 years. It took me far too long to realize she was not for me. My friends noticed it from the start. There were some subtle signs of her controlling behavior during our relationship, but I didn't fully understand the extent until we broke up. The real trouble began after our breakup. I worked with a group of friends on campus during the summer, and we were given free housing as part of our job. She also had a similar arrangement but worked for a different department. By this time, we had already ended our relationship. One of the strangest things she did was hang out by a large rock near my building. Every time I walked past it, she would be sitting there, crying. If I walked by with friends, she would give us intense stares. On one occasion, when I walked by with a female friend, I got a text from her within minutes accusing me of being involved with her. Things got even weirder when she started spying on me. The building where we were staying had a courtyard in the middle, with my room on one side and my friend's room directly across from me. One night, while I was hanging out in my room, my friends across the courtyard called me to say they had seen my ex hiding in the bushes under my window, dressed in all black, trying to spy on me. When I called her to confront her, she claimed she was at Walmart. The final straw came at a big spring concert at my college. I was there with my new girlfriend, who is now my wife, and, surprise, my ex was there too. She came up to us, looked at my wife, looked at me, and said, "This is fine. I don't care. This is totally fine," before walking away. Looking back, I can't believe I stayed in that relationship for 2 years. Story 24. There were countless troubling moments with the person I refer to as my psycho ex, but I only occasionally talk about him because of how distressing those memories are. One of the first and most significant warning signs came early in our relationship, during the first month we were together. Instead of fostering a supportive and healthy relationship, he chose to embarrass me for showing any signs of attraction or desire. He had a deeply troubling belief that only immoral women would actively express or seek out intimacy, even within a committed relationship. He constantly made me feel guilty for my natural feelings and tried to control how I viewed our closeness. The situation escalated dramatically the first time we were intimate. Instead of approaching her first with care and respect, he chose to violate my boundaries and trust. While I was asleep, he took advantage of me. This was both painful and deeply distressing. His rationale was rooted in his twisted belief, where he thought that women who enjoyed intimacy were somehow flawed or deserving of punishment. By having me into an experience that was painful and non-consensual, he made it clear that he wanted to enforce his disturbing views on me, regardless of my comfort or consent. These early incidents were just the beginning of a pattern of bad behavior that would define a relationship, which shows his disregard for my well-being and boundaries. When I was able to get income and started eating regularly, returning to a healthy weight, it would show me pictures of me he took without my consent in those first few months and tell me how I looked so much better then. Story 25. One evening, he invited a bunch of people over to hang out by his fire pit so I could meet his friends. I ended up getting along well with some of his guy friends because we had similar tastes in movies. But there was no flirting involved. As the last person was leaving, he and I were standing in the backyard by the gate. He suddenly grabbed me and pulled me towards him. I thought he was just going in for a hug, but that wasn't the case. It turned out he was upset that I got along so well with his friends. He was worried that they might steal me away from him, which I didn't understand at all. To make things even stranger, he had a large stick in his hand when he had pulled me from the fire. The stick was about 1 inch in diameter and still red hot. Instead of pulling me close for a hug, he was actually trying to pull my pants away from my body so he could brand me with a stick in a place that no one would see. I didn't notice the stick at first, but it left a scar. Thankfully, I don't have him in my life anymore. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.